All right, so the next thing that we are going to cover off is the allowance function. And the allowance function and the approve function pretty much go hand in hand together. So I'm going to code both of them together. Now, talking about the allowance function. So if we look at the allowance function, it basically takes two parameters as arguments. One is the owner and the other is the spender. So consider allowance function as an authority that you give to someone to act on your behalf. Like for instance, on OpenSea, you create an NFT and you give your NFT to the OpenSea contract. And then the OpenSea contract essentially is responsible for selling your NFT and giving you your royalty, your returns. A similar concept, let's say in real estate, you give some authority to the estate agent who trades on your behalf, or the settlement agent who trades on your behalf. So that's a real world example of giving somebody an allowance to execute a trade, to execute a buy or a sell on your behalf. You also have a similar concept in decentralized exchanges, or when you have trading bots, where you set some threshold limits that if I am making a 5% profit margin, then sell off all my tokens to whoever wants to buy it. So you essentially give the authority to some bot or to some other contract to execute the transaction on your behalf. So that's kind of how the allowance function pretty much works, and how the approve function works. So inside the allowance function, it's basically like a getter function, and you check that if somebody has an allowance to execute a transaction on your behalf. So it simply returns that a person has the authority to transact. So it just simply returns that one liner information. And inside the approve function, it's like signing a check. You basically approve or you let that transaction happen. So let me code this, and it will become more clearer as to what I mean. So talking about the allowance function, this function simply returns, as you can see, an unsigned integer 256. And what we're going to do inside this function is that we're going to simply say return and return allowed. So we're going to use the allowed mapping. So you can see that the allowed mapping is over here on the top. So that's our allowed mapping. And the allowed mapping simply has the person who is allowed to transact on our behalf, right? So we'll simply say return allowed, and the first part would be owner, so the person who has given the allowance, and the second part would be the spender, to whoever the allowance was granted. So all what we'll do in this function is simply return the mapping value of the owner and the spender who is allowed to spend on our behalf. Now, let's look at the approved function. And inside the approved function, we are actually going to make the allowance to the person who's going to work on our behalf, right? So this function will essentially come after the approve function. So if we call allowance on a person who's not allowed to spend on our behalf, there would be 0 tokens returned. But let's first code the approve, and then this would make more sense. So going into the approve function, the first thing that I need to do is that I'm taking in a couple of arguments, the spender who will spend on my behalf, who I'm approving, and the amount that I'm approving for the spender. So the first thing that I'm going to check is that my amount is greater than 0. So I'm simply going to put a require statement, and I'm going to say that my amount must be greater than 0. And if my amount is not greater than 0, then I'll simply prompt something back to the user. Amount must be greater than 0. And once I do that, the next thing I'm going to check is that the balance of the message.sender, so the person who is calling this function, that person, the balance of that person who's calling this function for this approval to happen, right? And that's going to be the person who's allowing the approval, the person who's signing the check. So does he have the balance to approve that amount? So I'm simply going to check that require and call the balances mapping, balances, and inside balances, the person who's calling this function, message.sender, and the amount of this person who's calling this function, does he have the amount that he is approving for? So if that is not the case, then simply prompt an error back. Balance of the sender should be greater than 0, right? And this message.sender is the person who is all right, so message.sender is the person who is setting the approval for the allowance to another person. So the message.sender is could be me allowing you to transact on my behalf, but obviously I can only allow you to transact on my behalf if I have that much amount. So first check if this amount is there. And the next thing is now calling the actual allowed function. So the allowed mapping. So I'll call the allowed mapping, which is over here. So I'll just simply copy it from the top. So inside the allowed mapping, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to allow who is the allowant, who is the person who is allowing, that person is the message.sender, and to whom the message.sender is allowing is the spender, the person who will spend on my behalf. And how much is he allowed to spend? That is the amount that I will allow him to spend. And since this function returns a true, so I will say return true once executed. That should be it, guys, for the approval function. And we'll run these and we'll see, we'll work with all of these once we deploy our smart contract. It's giving me an error over here, so let me just do a quick check. So I'm most probably missing a semicolon, and that should take care of the error. All right, so I have coded both the functions. One is the approve function, which sets the spender limit, and the other is to check if somebody has the limit to transact on my behalf. So in a perfect world, I would give somebody an approval that, hey, you can transact on my behalf. And then this can be used to check if somebody is allowed to transact on my behalf. So hope you understand that and the concept is clear. And with that, let's go on to our next session.